The cold January morning in 2019 started with something unusual happening on Maple Street. 6 police cars with no special markings quietly drove up to a normal 2-story house in Huntington, West Virginia. Neighbors looked through their curtains as police officers in special gear stood around the house. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski was making his morning coffee, the same thing he had done for almost 50 years as a well-liked high school teacher, community volunteer, and loving grandfather of 4. The loud knock on his door came at 7:32 a.m. David Kowalski, West Virginia State Police. We have a warrant to arrest you for the 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald. The officers would later say that the elderly man's hand shook a little as he put down his coffee cup, but his face stayed strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for half a century. March 16, 1971. The morning sun made long shadows across the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. Patricia Wilson, a second-year student studying to become a teacher, knocked many times on her friend Catherine's dorm room door. "She always met me for breakfast on Tuesdays," Patricia later told detectives. "When she didn't show up for class either, I knew something was wrong." Campus security found 22-year-old Catherine Fitzgerald lying on her dorm room floor, strangled with her own scarf. Her textbooks were open on her desk, notes half-written, a coffee cup still warm. No signs that someone broke in, no clear struggle, just a smart young life ended without warning or reason. For 50 years, the killer who took Catherine's life kept living just miles from where the crime happened. He went to community events where her parents spoke sadly about losing their daughter. He read newspaper stories about the case going cold every year. He watched as Catherine's younger sister became a lawyer, driven by the unfairness of her sister's unsolved murder. The killer coached Little League, served on the school board, and was named Citizen of the Year in 1997. He sent Christmas cards to detectives who had once talked to him as someone who might know something before deciding he wasn't guilty. For 5 decades, he hid behind a mask of being respectable while carrying the darkest secret in Cabell County history. How did this important community member avoid justice for half a century? What finally led investigators to his door after thousands of wrong paths? And most disturbing of all, how many lives crossed paths with a killer who walked freely among them, hiding in plain sight? Before we show you how this dangerous person was finally caught, and the amazing scientific methods that solved this very old case, take a second to click subscribe and hit the notification bell. This channel brings you the most interesting true crime stories with all the details that regular news leaves out. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this amazing story of delayed justice. Catherine Ann Fitzgerald was born to Elizabeth and Michael Fitzgerald on June 12, 1948 in Charleston, West Virginia. The oldest of 3 children, Catherine, Kathy to everyone who knew her, was described by family and friends as thoughtful, determined, and quietly ambitious. Her father worked as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department, while her mother taught piano lessons from their simple family home on Kanawha Boulevard. From an early age, Catherine showed a natural talent for science that made her different from other kids her age. At a time when women were still mostly expected to become teachers, nurses, or homemakers, Catherine wanted to become a doctor. Her high school yearbook photo caption reads, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." This was a big dream for a working-class girl from West Virginia in the late 1960s. She was brilliant, but never showed off about it, remembered her younger sister, Margaret, in a 2015 interview. "When I had trouble with homework, she'd help me figure it out myself instead of just giving me the answer." That's who she was, always teaching, always believing in people's potential. Catherine graduated as valedictorian from Charleston High School in 1967 and became the first person in her family to go to college when she enrolled at Marshall University's main campus in Huntington. After 2 successful years, she moved to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County to focus on her pre-med studies, where the smaller class sizes allowed for more personal attention. By 1971, Catherine was doing great. Her teachers always praised her work, especially in organic chemistry and biology. She lived in Sycamore Hall, a women's dorm that housed about 80 female students. Her roommate had left mid-semester because of family problems, leaving Catherine with a private room, a rare luxury for a college student at that time. The Marshall Satellite Campus in 1971 was a group of 5 red brick buildings sitting against the rolling Appalachian hills. With just over 120 students, it offered the close-knit community feel that Catherine liked better than the busier main campus. The town of Milton in Cabell County had a population of about 3,000, a place where people left doors unlocked and everyone seemed to know everyone else. Milton was the kind of place where the worst crime was usually kids knocking over mailboxes on Halloween, said retired Sheriff Jim Holloway. We had our share of family fights and the occasional bar fight. But violent crime, that wasn't part of our reality here. On campus, Catherine had made a small but close circle of friends. She worked part-time in the university library, went to meetings of the pre-medical society, and volunteered weekly at Cabell County Hospital. Her diary, found in her dorm room, showed a young woman careful with her schedule, dedicated to her studies, and thoughtfully planning a future that would never come. March 15, 1971, the day before her murder, started like any other Monday for Catherine. According to statements from classmates and professors, as well as her own diary entry from that morning, she went to her 8:30 a.m. comparative anatomy class, followed by advanced chemistry at 11 a.m. She ate lunch with her friend Patricia Wilson at the campus cafeteria around 1:15 p.m. where they talked about an upcoming biology exam. She seemed completely normal. Patricia later told detectives, "We talked about studying together that weekend. She was worried about the enzyme section, but that was just Kathy being Kathy. She always worried even though she'd end up with the highest grade." From 2:30 to 5 p.m., Catherine worked her shift at the library. The head librarian, Doris Malone, remembered that Catherine had seemed especially focused that day, reorganizing the medical reference section and helping a professor find hard-to-locate journal articles. At 5:30 p.m., security cameras captured Catherine entering the dining hall for dinner, where she ate alone while reviewing her notes. She checked out 2 books from the library at 7:15 p.m. before returning to her dorm room. At 9:20 p.m., she called her parents, a Monday night routine confirmed by phone records and her mother's statement. She talked about coming home the following weekend. Elizabeth Fitzgerald remembered in her first police interview. She wanted to celebrate her father's birthday. She sounded happy, making plans for the future. Catherine's final diary entry, written shortly before midnight on March 15th, read, "Tired but got a lot done today. Need to finish chem problem set before Wilson's class. Remember to mail Dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship application due Friday. Review once more." The next morning, Catherine would be found dead. Between these ordinary moments of a dedicated student's life and the horror of her murder lay a gap of about 9 hours. What happened in Catherine's dorm room between midnight and when her body was found at 9:15 a.m. remains the main mystery that haunted investigators for decades. These details of Catherine's life, her goals, her routines, her relationships, would later become important puzzle pieces as investigators tried to understand not just how she died, but who might have wanted to kill a promising young woman with no known enemies and seemingly nothing to hide. As we continue exploring this remarkable case, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in West Virginia, where this story happened, or thousands of miles away, true crime has a way of connecting us all to the basic questions of justice and human behavior. Let us know in the comments below as we continue uncovering the truth behind one of America's most confusing cold cases. At 9:17 a.m. on March 16, 1971, campus security officer Robert Gaines called the Cabell County Sheriff's Department with a code that hadn't been used in the county for over 10 years. 1031, possible homicide, Sycamore Hall, room 214. The time of that call marked the official beginning of what would become West Virginia's longest-running murder. Investigation. Patricia Wilson's morning had started with mild annoyance that turned to concern and finally terror when Catherine failed to meet her for their regular Tuesday breakfast at 7:30 a.m. Patricia first thought her friend had overslept. By 8:45 a.m., after Catherine missed their shared biology lecture, something she had never done before, Patricia's worry grew strong enough to convince her to skip the rest of class and check on her friend. "I knocked several times," Patricia remembered during her witness statement. "At first normal, then harder. I called out her name. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual, but the silence was. Catherine was always an early riser. Patricia found the resident advisor, 22-year-old Elaine Summers, who used her master key to open the door after her own knocks went unanswered. "I'll never forget Patricia's scream," Elaine later testified. "It didn't even sound human. I looked past her shoulder and saw Catherine on the floor. I pulled Patricia back, closed the door, and ran to call security. Officer Gaines arrived within minutes and secured the scene. His incident report, short and professional, described what he found. Female victim, approximately 20-25 years of age, lying face up on floor between desk and bed. Marks visible on neck from being strangled. No signs of life. Room undisturbed, door locked, window closed. Sheriff Thomas Hayward and Detective Frank Mullins arrived at 9:42 a.m., followed 20 minutes later by County Medical Examiner Dr. Howard Levitt. By 10:30 a.m., the small campus was filled with law enforcement as news of the murder spread through the shocked community. The initial scene check suggested several immediate concerns. Detective Mullins wrote in his case notes, "The victim appeared to have been strangled with what we later identified as her own scarf. There was no sign that someone broke in. The room was neat and orderly except for the area right around the body. Most strangely, there were 2 coffee cups on the desk, both apparently used recently. This detail, the second coffee cup, would become the most interesting and frustrating piece of evidence in the case. It suggested Catherine had willingly let her killer into her room, likely someone she knew and trusted enough to share a late-night coffee." Dr. Levitt's first examination at the scene established the time of death between 11:30 p.m. Monday night and 2:30 a.m. Tuesday morning. Catherine was dressed in jeans and a Marshall University sweatshirt, not sleepwear, showing she hadn't been getting ready for bed when she was killed. "The marks show steady pressure," Dr. Levitt noted in his initial report. "The person approached from behind using a lot of force. Death would have happened within minutes. The victim likely had very little opportunity to defend herself. Indeed, the only signs of struggle were defensive bruising on Catherine's forearms and broken fingernails on her right hand. The killer had been both quick and powerful." As investigators processed the scene, they made several observations that would shape the initial investigation. Catherine's wallet remained untouched in her purse with $43 inside, ruling out robbery as a reason. Her class notes were still open on her desk beside the 2 coffee cups, suggesting she might have been studying when her visitor arrived. Her door had been locked from the inside with a key that was later found in her pocket, a detail that confused investigators. Either the killer had their own key, which was highly unlikely given the university's strict key control, or they locked the door from inside and left through the window, Detective Mullins thought. The window, however, showed no signs of being opened, and the 3-story drop would have been hard to handle without getting hurt. By noon, news of the murder had spread beyond the campus to the wider community. Local radio stations interrupted regular programming with special bulletins. The campus administration quickly called an emergency meeting where they announced the cancellation of all classes for the rest of the week. "The phones in our office rang non-stop," remembered Linda Jenkins, who worked as a secretary in the administration building. Parents were panicking, wanting to pick up their children immediately. Students were crying in the hallways. It was like the whole world had suddenly shifted beneath our feet. The reaction from the tight-knit Milton community was equally strong. Local businesses closed early. Churches opened their doors for sudden prayer services. The town mayor appeared on local television, asking for calm while promising that no resource would be spared in bringing this criminal to justice. As investigators continued working the crime scene throughout that Tuesday, they carefully collected evidence that would eventually, decades later, prove important in solving the case. Fingerprints from the coffee cups, fibers from the carpet near the body, and tiny skin samples from beneath Catherine's fingernails where she had scratched her attacker. "We're treating everything as possible evidence," Sheriff Hayward told reporters at a quickly arranged press conference that evening. "At this stage, we have more questions than answers, but I want to assure both the campus and the wider community that this case is our absolute priority." By Wednesday morning, March 17th, investigators had begun building a timeline of Catherine's final hours, piecing together witness statements, security camera footage, and physical evidence. p.m. Catherine checks out 2 books from the library. March 8:45 p.m. Catherine is seen, studying alone in the dorm common room by several. Witnesses, 50 p.m. Catherine returns. To her room, according to her. Hallmate who briefly spoke with her, Tway. Chemist Catherine calls her parents. Confirmed by phone records, 15 p.m. Catherine's neighbor across the hall hears what sounds like a kettle whistling in Catherine's room. Swing to 5 p.m. The same neighbor reports hearing muffled voices from Catherine's room, not arguing, just conversation. 45 p.m., 2:30 a.m. Estimated time of death based on medical examiner's findings, 15 a.m. Body discovered. The investigation's first major challenge appeared when they tried to identify who might have visited Catherine that night. Her diary had no mention of expecting company, and none of her friends reported any plans to meet with her. The coffee cups told us someone was there, but nobody would admit to being that someone, Detective Mullins later explained. Either the killer was a stranger who somehow gained her trust instantly, or it was someone she knew well enough to invite in late at night, someone who wasn't coming forward. The second major challenge involved the dorm security. Sycamore Hall had strict visitor rules requiring guests to sign in at the front desk and leave by 10 p.m. The sign-in log for March 15th showed no visitors for Catherine, and the night guard insisted no unauthorized persons had entered the building after hours. This left investigators with a troubling conclusion. Either the killer was another dorm resident, a university employee with access privileges, or someone who had found a way to get around the building's security measures. The coffee cups gave the investigation's first real leads. Both contained traces of the same instant coffee brand that Catherine kept in her room. But while her fingerprints were on one cup, the other had been wiped clean, an intentional act that suggested planning ahead. By Friday, March 19th, investigators had interviewed 47 people, including Catherine's friends, professors, dorm residents, and campus staff. They'd taken fingerprints from 23 potential suspects and collected hair samples from 15. Each person had provided alibis for the night in question. Though not all could be immediately checked, the more we dig, the more complicated this gets, Sheriff Hayward admitted in his case notes that weekend. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone targeted this young woman specifically. Someone comfortable enough in her presence to share a late-night coffee. Someone careful enough to clean their fingerprints afterward. And someone who knew how to enter and exit that room without being detected. As Catherine's body was released to her family for funeral services the following Monday, the investigation hit its first major roadblock. With no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and a crime scene that raised more questions than answers, detectives found themselves chasing shadows. The funeral in Charleston drew over 400 mourners, including dozens of classmates who traveled from Cabell County. The university president delivered a speech praising Catherine's academic promise and personal character. Her father, staying strong throughout the service, broke down only when his daughter's casket was lowered into the ground. "We demand justice for our daughter," Elizabeth Fitzgerald told reporters afterward, her voice steady despite her tear-streaked face. "Someone out there knows what happened to Catherine. We beg you to come forward." What neither the grieving family nor the determined investigators could have imagined that day was that justice would take half a century to arrive, or that the key to solving the case was already in their possession, preserved in an evidence box that would sit untouched for decades, waiting for science to catch up to a killer who walked freely among them. By April 1971, the initial shock of Catherine Fitzgerald's murder had changed into something more dangerous: fear. Enrollment numbers at the satellite campus dropped as parents withdrew their daughters. Female students began traveling in groups even during daylight hours. The administration installed additional lighting and hired security guards to patrol the grounds 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, the investigation that had begun with such urgency and promise was hitting one dead end after another. Detective Frank Mullins kept a careful approach, creating 3 circles of suspicion around Catherine: those closest to her daily life, those who crossed paths with her regularly, and those who might have met her randomly. This approach gave an initial suspect list of 27 individuals. "We started with the obvious," Mullins wrote in his case summary. Former boyfriends, male classmates who had shown interest in her, faculty members who had close contact with her. Catherine's most recent boyfriend, Thomas Mitchell, a graduate student at the Maine Marshall campus in Huntington, became the investigation's first focus. They had dated for 8 months before breaking up in January 1971. The split had been Catherine's decision, according to her diary entries. She wrote that he became too controlling and couldn't understand her putting med school first over marriage. Classic motive territory, Detective Mullins noted. Mitchell was questioned 3 times during the initial investigation. His alibi that he was studying with classmates in Huntington 30 miles away was confirmed by multiple witnesses. Phone records showed he made a call from his dorm phone at 11:30 p.m., within the estimated window of Catherine's murder. Reluctantly, investigators ruled him out. The second major suspect came from witness statements. Janet Meadows, who lived down the hall from Catherine, reported seeing a maintenance worker leaving the area of Catherine's room around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, well after normal working hours. He didn't have any tools with him, Meadows stated. I remember thinking that was odd, but he smiled and said good evening, so I didn't think much more about it. This led investigators to Raymond Lewis, a 43-year-old university maintenance employee with access to all dorm buildings. Lewis had a minor criminal record, 2 disorderly conduct charges from bar fights in his 20s. Initial interviews showed inconsistencies in his story of that evening, making him a prime suspect. For nearly 2 weeks, the case against Lewis fell apart when investigators discovered he had been admitted to Cabell County Hospital at 9:45 p.m. on March 15th with a broken ankle from falling off a ladder. Hospital records confirmed he remained there until the following morning, physically unable to commit the murder. We're not sure who Janet Meadows saw, Sheriff Hayward acknowledged in a press briefing, but it couldn't have been Raymond Lewis. The third important early suspect was Professor William Harris, who taught Catherine's advanced chemistry class. Several students reported that Harris had shown special interest in Catherine's academic work, often asking her to stay after class for discussions. One classmate described his behavior as borderline inappropriate. Harris voluntarily agreed to questioning and fingerprinting. His alibi that he was home with his wife and teenage children was confirmed. Furthermore, his fingerprints didn't match any found in Catherine's room. Despite lingering suspicions, investigators couldn't connect him to the crime scene. By late April, all 27 individuals on the initial suspect list had been investigated and cleared through alibis, forensic inconsistencies, or lack of physical evidence connecting them to the scene. The investigation had reached its first major standstill. We're dealing with either incredible luck or calculated precision, Detective Mullins wrote to Sheriff Hayward in a memo dated April 30th, 1971. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. Someone planned this carefully. The investigation then expanded to include Catherine's activities beyond campus. Detectives interviewed staff at local businesses she visited regularly, patients she met during her hospital volunteer work, and even bus drivers on routes she regularly took. This expanded effort added 43 more names to the suspect list, each carefully investigated and eventually cleared. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the crime scene evidence, limited by 1970s technology, gave minimal results. The coffee cups had been dusted for fingerprints using basic powder methods. The clean cup showed nothing, while Catherine's cup showed only her own prints. The scarf used to strangle her contained no foreign fibers or hair that could be matched to a suspect with the technology available. Most promisingly, skin samples recovered from beneath Catherine's fingernails showed she had scratched her attacker, likely leaving visible marks. Investigators checked the arms, necks, and faces of every suspect interviewed, finding no suspicious scratches. The samples were preserved in the evidence locker, but DNA testing was still years away from becoming an investigative tool. Our biggest challenge wasn't just identifying suspects, it was keeping the evidence we did have safe and usable, explained Thomas Hayward in a 1996 interview long after his retirement as sheriff. We knew what we had, but we didn't have the science to make sense of it. All we could do was preserve everything carefully and hope technology would eventually catch up. The preservation methods of the 1970s were basic by modern standards. Evidence was stored in paper bags rather than plastic containers, increasing the risk of contamination. Temperature-controlled storage facilities didn't exist in Cabell County, exposing biological samples to damage. Documentation relied on handwritten chain of custody forms that occasionally had gaps or errors. Despite these limitations, Detective Mullins insisted on extra care with the Catherine Fitzgerald evidence. He personally watched over the packaging and storage of all items, using stricter rules than were standard for the time. This careful planning would ultimately prove important decades later. By summer 1971, media interest in the case began to fade. Local newspapers reduced coverage from front-page stories to occasional updates buried in later sections. Television stations moved on to newer headlines. The fading public attention concerned the investigators who worried that potential witnesses might forget important details as time passed. In June, a potentially important witness came forward. Margaret Simmons, an elderly woman who lived in an apartment with a view of Sycamore Hall, claimed to have seen a man climbing out of a window around 1 a.m. on the night of the murder. She described him as average height, wearing dark clothing, but could provide no further details that might identify him. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," she told detectives. "I thought maybe it was just some boy sneaking out after visiting his girlfriend after hours. It wasn't until I read about poor Catherine that I wondered if it might be connected." Investigators found Simmons's timeline matched the estimated time of death, but her vague description offered little useful information. They searched the area again, asking if anyone else had witnessed unusual activity that night, but no other witnesses came forward. By September 1971, 6 months after Catherine's murder, the investigation had effectively stalled. Detective Mullins and his team had pursued 124 different leads, interviewed 201 people, and collected 97 pieces of physical evidence. They had built and thrown out dozens of theories, followed promising leads that disappeared under examination, and exhausted every investigative path available with 1970s-era techniques. Sheriff Hayward faced the difficult task of meeting with the Fitzgerald family to tell them the news that their daughter's case was being classified as open but inactive, the official term for a cold case. It was the hardest conversation of my career, Hayward later recalled. Michael Fitzgerald just stared at me with empty eyes. Elizabeth clutched her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They didn't cry or shout. They just nodded as if they'd been expecting this moment all along. Their quiet dignity was more heartbreaking than any outburst could have been. The Fitzgeralds made one request: that all evidence be preserved forever, no matter how unimportant it might seem. Sheriff Hayward gave his personal promise, a promise that would connect 1971 to 2019 through a chain of carefully kept evidence boxes, waiting for science to develop enough to speak for a victim whose voice had been silenced. If you're finding this story interesting, hit the like button to help others discover it too. The scientific techniques that eventually solved this case are nothing short of amazing, and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming next. What time is it where you're watching? It's interesting to think that while you're tuning in from different time zones around the world right now, Catherine's killer spent nearly 50 years checking his watch daily, perhaps wondering if this would be the day his past finally caught up with him. The Fitzgerald family returned to their Charleston home after Catherine's funeral, to find it filled with casseroles, sympathy cards, and the crushing weight of unanswered questions. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, once a vibrant piano teacher with 27 students, stopped giving lessons. Michael Fitzgerald took a 6-month leave of absence from the highway department, returning as a shell of his former self. The first year was about survival. Margaret Fitzgerald, Catherine's younger sister, remembered in a 2010 interview. Mom would set the dinner table for 4, then freeze when she realized it should be 3. Dad would start sentences with, "When Kathy comes home for Christmas," then trail off into silence. We lived in a house haunted not by Catherine's ghost, but by her absence. For the Fitzgeralds, justice became a family mission. When the active investigation was stopped in September 1971, Michael Fitzgerald began keeping careful records in a series of leather-bound journals. He wrote down every conversation with law enforcement, every newspaper article, every potential lead, no matter how small. By the time of his death in 1994, these journals filled 17 volumes, a father's desperate attempt to solve what authorities could not. The Fitzgerald case has never been about lack of evidence. Keller explained in a department memo requesting funding for advanced DNA testing in late 2018. It's been about our inability to connect that evidence to a specific individual. The genetic genealogy techniques that identified the Golden State Killer could be our path to finally bringing Catherine's killer to justice. Her request was approved in January 2019, setting in motion the final chapter of a story that had begun nearly 5 decades earlier. As the evidence was carefully packaged for shipment to a special laboratory, no one involved could have predicted how quickly Catherine's killer would be identified, or how shocking that identification would prove to be. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who had kept her quiet determination for justice across 48 years, would live just long enough to see her daughter's killer identified. The woman who had founded an advocacy organization, testified before legislators, and kept her daughter's memory alive through decades of disappointment, would finally get the answer she had sought since that terrible March morning in 1971. On February 12, 2019, Detective Sarah Keller carefully sealed the evidence package containing skin samples from beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails. The package, about the size of a paperback book but treated with the respect of a sacred object, represented the last best hope for solving a case that had haunted 3 generations of law enforcement officers. I remember thinking, "This is it," Keller later recalled. "Either this works or we accept that Catherine's case might never be solved." The samples were headed for Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of a handful of private laboratories specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. This revolutionary approach to DNA analysis had emerged from an unexpected combination of recreational ancestry testing, big data analytics, and traditional forensic science. Unlike regular DNA testing that requires a direct match in criminal databases, genetic genealogy could identify suspects through their distant relatives, people who had voluntarily submitted DNA to commercial ancestry services for completely different purposes. The technique had already solved dozens of cold cases nationwide since its first successful use in 2018, many dating back decades. Traditional DNA analysis is like trying to find someone using only their exact address, explained Dr. Eleanor Wright, the forensic genetic genealogist assigned to Catherine's case. Genetic genealogy is like being able to locate someone by finding their cousins, then working out where they must live, based on those family connections. It exponentially expands our search capabilities. The process began with extracting usable DNA from the skin samples preserved since 1971. This presented the first major challenge. The samples had broken down significantly over 48 years, despite the careful preservation efforts of multiple evidence custodians. We received approximately 4 nanograms of highly fragmented DNA, Dr. Wright noted in her preliminary report. Under normal circumstances, this would be insufficient for analysis. However, advances in amplification techniques allowed us to work with this limited material. Using a process called whole genome amplification, the laboratory created enough copies of the DNA fragments to proceed with analysis. The team then generated a DNA profile focusing on hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, far more than the 20 markers used in standard law enforcement databases. This expanded profile was compared against profiles in public genetic databases where users had chosen to make their information available for law enforcement matching. The initial comparison gave no direct matches, but identified 17 individuals who shared enough genetic markers with the crime scene DNA to be distant relatives of the killer. These weren't close relatives like siblings or children, Dr. Wright explained. They were primarily third and fourth cousins, people who likely had never met the person who committed the crime but shared great-great-grandparents. From these distant connections, the genetic genealogy team began the painstaking process of building family trees. Working backward through historical records, they identified common ancestors among the matching individuals, then worked forward through birth, marriage, and death certificates to build a complete family structure spanning multiple generations. It's like solving a massive puzzle where you don't know what the final picture looks like, said Dr. Wright. We were essentially mapping the killer's extended family without knowing who the killer was. By late March 2019, the team had built family trees containing over 2,400 individuals across 7 generations. They then began narrowing the field by applying filters based on what was known about the killer. Male, likely between 18 to 40 years old in 1971, and with some connection to Cabell County, West Virginia. This filtering process reduced the pool to 38 potential suspects. Further refinement based on geographical location during the time of the murder narrowed the list to just 7 men who were in the right place, at the right time with the right genetic Connections. Detective Keller received the short list on April 2nd, 2019. When I opened that email, I expected to see a list of names I'd never come across before, she recalled. Instead, I found myself staring at several names that appeared throughout our case files, including one that made my blood run cold. Third on the list was David Kowalski, age 78, current resident of Huntington, West Virginia. A quick search of the digitized case files showed that Kowalski had been interviewed during the original 1971 investigation, not as a suspect, but as a witness. At the time, he was a 30-year-old chemistry teacher at the local high school who occasionally gave guest lectures at the Marshall Satellite campus. Kowalski had told investigators he occasionally tutored Catherine in advanced chemistry, though he claimed their relationship was strictly professional. His statement showed he had last seen her 2 weeks before her murder. He provided an alibi of being home with his wife on the night of the murder, which was confirmed at the time. With no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene and no obvious motive, investigators had quickly moved on to more promising suspects. What struck me immediately was how minor he seemed in the original investigation, said Keller. He was interviewed as a routine part of questioning Catherine's instructors. His name appears exactly twice in over 2,000 pages of case notes. Before approaching Kowalski directly, Keller needed to confirm the genetic connection. Rather than requesting a DNA sample that might alert him to the investigation, she used a technique that had become standard in genetic genealogy cases: covert collection of discarded DNA. For 3 days, surveillance teams watched Kowalski's movements, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came when he visited a local coffee shop, leaving behind a paper cup that was quickly retrieved by an undercover officer. The cup was rushed to the state crime laboratory, where technicians extracted a DNA sample from saliva residue on the rim. The results came back on April 7th. The DNA from Kowalski's coffee cup matched the DNA from under Catherine's fingernails with a probability of 99.9998% after 48 years. Catherine Fitzgerald's killer had a name. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the report, feeling this strange mix of joy and horror, Keller said. Joy because we finally had our answer. Horror because of who that answer turned out to be. The horror came not just from solving the case, but from what investigators discovered as they dug into Kowalski's life over the 5 decades since Catherine's murder. Far from being a shadowy figure lurking at the edges of society, David Kowalski had become a pillar of the Cabell County community. After teaching high school chemistry for 12 years, he had joined the Marshall University faculty in 1983, eventually becoming chair of the chemistry department before retiring in 2009. He had served on the Milton City Council. For 3 terms in the 1990s, he had coached youth soccer for nearly 2 decades. The local Rotary Club had named him Citizen of the Year in 1997 for his community service. Most disturbingly, Kowalski had maintained connections to the Fitzgerald family over the years. He had attended Catherine's funeral in 1971. He had made small but regular donations to the scholarship fund established in her name. He had even served alongside Elizabeth Fitzgerald on a 1985 Governor's Task Force for Campus Safety Improvements, looking her in the eye while carrying the secret of her daughter's murder. The level of deception required to live that kind of double life for nearly 5 decades is almost beyond understanding, said Dr. Elena Cassidy, a forensic psychologist consulted during the final phase of the investigation. This wasn't someone who committed a crime and then disappeared. This was someone who remained embedded in the very community hurt by his actions, who built an identity as a respected citizen while knowing the truth about himself. With the DNA match confirmed, Detective Keller put together a team to plan Kowalski's arrest. The operation would need to be handled carefully, not only because of Kowalski's age and community standing, but because of the media storm that would surely follow the resolution of such a high-profile cold case. On January 15, 2019, as dawn broke over Huntington, 6 unmarked police vehicles surrounded the modest 2-story home where David Kowalski had lived for over 40 years. As officers approached his door, none could have anticipated the final twists this case would take, or how the community would react to learning that a monster had been hiding among them all along. Elizabeth used her grief differently. In 1973, she founded West Virginia Families for Justice, a group for relatives of unsolved murder victims. The organization pushed for better evidence preservation laws, longer time limits for prosecution, and increased funding for cold case units. What began as 4 grieving families meeting in the Fitzgerald's living room grew to over 300 members by the 1990s, becoming an influential voice in state criminal justice reform. My daughter's killer took more than just her life. Elizabeth told the West Virginia legislature during testimony for a 1978 bill that would eventually establish the state's first cold case review team. He took our peace, our trust in the world, our sense of order. But he will not take our determination to see justice done, whether it takes years or decades. Margaret, only 16 when her sister was murdered, found her life's direction changed forever. Giving up her plans to study literature, she instead pursued a law degree, graduating from West Virginia University in 1980. She joined the Cabell County Prosecutor's Office, specializing in violent crimes. Though ethical rules prevented her from working directly on her sister's case, Margaret became a fierce advocate for victims' rights throughout the state. "I couldn't save Catherine," she explained in her first press interview after becoming an assistant prosecutor, "but I can make sure other families don't experience the helplessness we felt in Cabell County." Catherine's case remained officially open, but collected dust as new crimes demanded attention. Detective Frank Mullins, who had led the original investigation, asked to review the case every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, a personal ritual he kept up until his retirement in 1992. "Frank never let it go," said James Thornton, who served as a junior detective under Mullins. "Every March 16th, he'd pull out the files, spread everything across the conference table, and go through it all again. Sometimes he'd find some small detail we'd overlooked, but mostly it was his way of telling Catherine she wasn't forgotten." The case files themselves went through a physical journey that mirrored the investigation's stops and starts. First stored in the active case room at the Cabell County Sheriff's Department, they were moved to the basement archives in 1972, then to the newly built county records facility in 1985. During a flood in 1997, a deputy sheriff reportedly carried the Fitzgerald evidence boxes to higher ground on his shoulders, refusing to let anyone else handle them. Media coverage of the case rose and fell over the decades, typically coming back around important anniversaries. The 5-year mark in 1976 brought a week-long series in the Huntington Herald-Dispatch, titled "Justice Delayed, the Catherine Fitzgerald Mystery." The 10th anniversary in 1981 saw the first television documentary about the case, produced by a Charleston station and featuring interviews with investigators and family members. The 20th anniversary in 1991, Catherine's murder had changed from recent tragedy to local legend. The Marshall University student newspaper published a look-back that accidentally contained several factual errors, showing how details had begun to blur in public memory. The article prompted a stern letter from Elizabeth Fitzgerald, correcting the record and reminding readers that this is not folklore, this is our ongoing nightmare. The 25th anniversary in 1996 happened at the same time as the emergence of DNA analysis as a forensic tool. This technological development sparked renewed interest in the case, with local media wondering whether Catherine's murder might finally be solved through this revolutionary technique. Sheriff William Donovan, who had been a rookie deputy when Catherine was killed, authorized the first cold case review of the Fitzgerald murder in 1996. A team of 4 detectives spent 6 weeks re-examining every piece of evidence and re-interviewing surviving witnesses. Their findings, while not leading to an arrest, did result in the evidence being repackaged using modern preservation techniques. The skin samples from under Catherine's fingernails were our most promising biological evidence, explained forensic technician Sandra Morris, who supervised the repackaging. In 1971, they were stored in a paper envelope. We transferred them to sterile containers and properly refrigerated them. If there was DNA present, we gave it the best chance of survival. The first actual DNA testing of evidence from Catherine's case happened in 1998, but the technology was still in its early stages. The tests used up valuable sample material while giving unclear results. A devastating setback that nearly destroyed the biological evidence before it could be analyzed. With more advanced techniques, we were ahead of the science. Sheriff Donovan admitted in a press conference announcing the disappointing results. But we've preserved what remains for future testing. This case will be solved. It's just a matter of when the technology catches up to our determination. As the investigation repeatedly stalled and restarted, Cabell County itself went through big changes. The Marshall Satellite Campus, where Catherine had studied, expanded into a full-fledged regional center before ultimately being absorbed back into the main university system in 1989. Sycamore Hall, the dorm where she was murdered, was torn down in 2001 to make way for a modern, residential complex, an event that prompted another brief burst of media coverage about the unsolved case. The town of Milton grew from a rural community of 3,000 to a suburban extension of Huntington with nearly 10,000 residents by 2010. The arrival of new residents meant that, increasingly, Catherine's story was unknown to many who lived where it had happened. Local schools began including the case in West Virginia history lessons, making sure new generations would remember what longtime residents couldn't forget. Throughout these decades of change, Catherine's murder continued to influence local law enforcement procedures and policies. The case became a warning tale taught to every new officer in the county, emphasizing the importance of proper evidence collection and preservation. Before Fitzgerald, we treated evidence like it only needed to last until trial, explained Police Academy instructor Robert Jenkins in 2005. After Fitzgerald, we began treating evidence like it might need to speak for the victim 50 years later. That fundamental shift in thinking has helped solve dozens of cases that might otherwise have gone cold. The case also led to important security improvements at educational institutions throughout West Virginia. In 1972, directly responding to Catherine's murder, the State Board of Education required enhanced security measures for all campus dorms, including electronic key systems, visitor registration rules, and 24-hour security staffing. These standards, revolutionary at the time, became models for campus safety nationwide. By the 30th anniversary in 2001, the investigation had been officially reviewed 5 times, each review using new forensic techniques as they became available. Fingerprints were run through automated identification systems. Fibers were analyzed using electron microscopes. Witness statements were evaluated using statement analysis methods that didn't exist in 1971. The 40th anniversary in 2011 marked a turning point in how the case was seen by both the public and law enforcement. What had once been discussed as a tragedy that might be solved someday was increasingly viewed as a cold case that might never be resolved. The Herald-Dispatch's anniversary coverage that year carried the sad headline, 4 decades later, "Has justice for Catherine Fitzgerald become impossible?" Elizabeth Fitzgerald, then 84 and in failing health, gave what many assumed would be her final interview about her daughter's case. "I've accepted that I may not live to see Catherine's killer brought to justice," she told the newspaper. "But I believe that day will come. Science advances. People's consciences trouble them as they age. Secrets become harder to keep. Someone knows something, and someday that knowledge will come to light." What Elizabeth could not have known was that the breakthrough was already beginning to take shape through a revolutionary approach to DNA analysis that would change cold case investigations worldwide. In 2012, the FBI launched the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS upgrade that expanded the genetic markers used in DNA profiling from 13 to 20, dramatically increasing the system's identification capabilities. The following year, the first successful use of familial DNA searching in a U.S. criminal case demonstrated how investigators could identify suspects through their relatives' genetic information. By 2018, genetic genealogy, the technique of using commercial DNA databases to identify criminal suspects through family connections, had emerged as a powerful new tool in cold case investigations. The arrest of the Golden State Killer that April, solving crimes dating back to the 1970s, sent shockwaves through both the law enforcement community and the public. In Cabell County, these developments were watched with particular interest by Detective Sarah Keller, who had inherited the Fitzgerald case file in 2015. A careful investigator with special training in cold case methods, Keller had spent her first 3 years on the case digitizing all records and evidence documentation, creating the first complete electronic database of the investigation. "The identity of the killer will shock you," Comment below with your theories about how David Kowalski managed to avoid justice for so long. Was it calculated brilliance, institutional failures, or simply luck that allowed him to live freely, while Catherine's family suffered for decades? When David Kowalski opened his front door on that January morning in 2019, he faced Detective Sarah Keller and 5 officers with an expression that witnesses would later describe as resigned recognition. He offered no resistance as they read him his rights, placed him in handcuffs, and walked him to a waiting police vehicle. His only words were directed to his wife of 47 years. "Call Attorney Simmons. Tell him it's about the Fitzgerald girl." News of Kowalski's arrest spread through Cabell County with the speed and force of a shockwave. By noon, every local news outlet had broken the story, many struggling to make sense of the beloved community figure with the cold-blooded killer now revealed. Former students, colleagues, and neighbors expressed disbelief, creating a mental conflict that would define the community's response in the days to come. "It can't be Dr. K," insisted former student Jason Reynolds in a television interview. "He was the gentlest man I knew. He wrote my college recommendation letter. He attended my wedding." Yet the evidence told a different story, one that became clearer as investigators pieced together Kowalski's movements on the night of March 15, 1971, and his life in the decades that followed. In 1971, David Kowalski was a 30-year-old high school chemistry teacher with goals of joining the university faculty. Married for just 2 years to his wife Diane, he added to their income by tutoring college students and occasionally giving guest lectures at the Marshall Satellite campus. His reputation was that of a strict but fair instructor with a particular talent for explaining complex concepts. What no one knew was that Kowalski had developed an inappropriate fixation on Catherine Fitzgerald after meeting her at a campus lecture series. Catherine's diary, re-examined after Kowalski's arrest, contained brief mentions of Mr. K offering extra help with chemistry concepts, interactions she viewed as purely academic, but which investigators now believe Kowalski saw differently. Based on the evidence, we believe Kowalski visited Catherine's room that night under the pretense of discussing an upcoming chemistry exam. Detective Keller explained at a press conference following the arrest. The coffee cup suggests she welcomed him as a trusted instructor. Something during that interaction, likely a rejection of romantic advances, triggered the violence that followed. After strangling Catherine, Kowalski carefully wiped down surfaces he had touched, removed the second coffee cup, which was never found, and left through the dorm's main entrance during a shift change when security was briefly absent. He returned home to his wife, who later confirmed to investigators that she had been taking sleep medication at that time and had no memory of what time her husband came to bed. The most disturbing aspect of the case was not the murder itself, but Kowalski's behavior in the 5 decades that followed. Rather than fleeing the area or withdrawing from public life, he did the opposite, embedding himself deeper into the community and building an identity that made him above suspicion. This wasn't just a cover, it was a complete reinvention, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Ilana Cassidy. Kowalski didn't just hide. He transformed himself into someone people would trust completely. It's a level of calculated deception rarely seen even in psychopathic offenders. In the years following Catherine's murder, Kowalski's career thrived. He completed a PhD in chemistry through night classes, joined the Marshall University faculty in 1983, and eventually became department chair. He published respected research papers, mentored countless students, and received teaching awards. His community service record was equally impressive: youth sports coach, city council member, church deacon, and regular volunteer for local charities. Most chillingly, Kowalski maintained peripheral connections to the case itself. He attended memorial services on the major anniversaries of Catherine's death. He gave quotes to newspaper articles about the impact of the unsolved murder on the community. In 1991, he even participated in a panel discussion about campus safety improvements put in place since the tragedy. "He didn't just get away with murder," said Margaret Fitzgerald, after learning of Kowalski's arrest. "He used my sister's death to build his reputation as a concerned citizen." The intentional cruelty of that is almost harder to understand than the murder itself. Searches of Kowalski's home following his arrest revealed a hidden collection of newspaper clippings about the case, carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves and organized chronologically. Investigators also discovered a small box containing what appeared to be the missing coffee cup from Catherine's room. Wrapped in a handkerchief and hidden behind a false panel in his basement workshop. He kept trophies, Detective Keller noted, not displayed openly but hidden where only he could access them. It suggests he revisited the crime mentally throughout his life. As the community struggled with these revelations, many found it hard to reconcile the David Kowalski they knew with the monster now revealed. Former students recalled his patience and encouragement. Neighbors remembered his reliable snow shoveling and lawn mowing for elderly residents. Fellow church members pointed to his generous donations to mission trips and food pantries. The hardest part for many people to accept, said Mayor Robert Jenkins, who had served on the city council with Kowalski in the 1990s, is that both versions of this man are true. The mentor who helped countless students succeed, and the killer who took Catherine's life existed in the same person. Our community is struggling with that contradiction. What's the weather like where you are today? As this story unfolds in all its complexity, I'm curious about the conditions where you're watching from. Perhaps a reminder that while we're connected through this narrative, we're experiencing it from different places, just as the people of Cabell County experienced different versions of the man they thought they knew. The Cabell County courthouse had never seen a media presence like the one that assembled for David Kowalski's arraignment on January 17, 2019. News vans lined the streets, satellite dishes crowded the courthouse lawn, and journalists from national outlets jostled with local reporters for limited seating in the courtroom. The case had gone beyond regional interest to become a national story about justice delayed but not denied. Inside the courtroom, Kowalski appeared a diminished figure. His academic regalia and community awards replaced by an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. At 78, his once commanding presence had given way to stooped shoulders and thinning white hair. Yet his eyes remained alert, scanning the courtroom with the same analytical gaze that had assessed chemistry experiments and student potential for decades. Judge Martha Simmons, herself a former student of Kowalski's, recused herself immediately. The integrity of these proceedings must be beyond question, she stated, before turning the case over to Judge William Harmon from neighboring Wayne County. Kowalski entered a not guilty plea, but his attorney's actions afterward suggested this was merely a formality. Within days, defense lawyer Thomas Simmons had started discussions with prosecutors about a potential plea agreement, discussions that intensified after DNA results were confirmed by a second independent laboratory. Meanwhile, the community's reaction changed from initial shock to something more complex. Cabell County found itself divided between those who could not reconcile the beloved teacher with the cold-blooded killer, and those who felt betrayed by decades of deception. Spontaneous memorials appeared at two locations: flowers at Catherine's former dorm site and angry messages taped to the chemistry building that bore Kowalski's name on a donor plaque. Marshall University moved quickly to distance itself from its former faculty member, removing his name from an annual chemistry scholarship and establishing a new fellowship in Catherine Fitzgerald's memory. The city council voted unanimously to take back his Citizen of the Year award from 1997. Former colleagues issued statements expressing horror and disbelief. "We're all questioning everything now," said Dr. Robert Chen, current chemistry department chair. "How many students did we send to his office hours alone? How many young women sought his mentorship? The betrayal extends beyond Catherine to every person who trusted him over 5 decades. For the Fitzgerald family, Kowalski's arrest brought a complicated mixture of emotions. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, now 92 and in assisted living, received the news from Detective Keller personally. She just nodded very calmly, Keller recalled. Then she said, "I knew I would live to see this day." It wasn't triumphant or emotional. It was a simple statement of fact from a woman who had never stopped believing justice would come. Margaret Fitzgerald, now 64 and recently retired from her legal career, became the family's public voice. At a press conference following the arraignment, she spoke with the measured precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms. "For 48 years, we've lived with an absence. The absence of Catherine and the absence of answers," she told the assembled reporters. "Today, half of that void has been filled. We now know who took Catherine from us. But the greater absence remains, and no arrest or conviction can restore the decades of life stolen from my sister or from our family as we knew it." When asked about her feelings toward Kowalski, Margaret's composure momentarily wavered. I sat across from him at community functions. I exchanged pleasantries with him at university events. I once thanked him for his donation to Catherine's scholarship fund. The calculated cruelty of his deception is almost harder to process than the murder itself. On March 15, 2019, exactly 48 years after Catherine's murder, David Kowalski accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to first-degree murder, prosecutors agreed not to pursue additional charges related to evidence, tampering, and obstruction of justice that could have extended legal proceedings for years. The sentencing hearing on April 30th drew an overflow crowd. The courthouse opened 2 additional rooms with video feeds to accommodate those who wished to witness this final chapter. Among them were former students, colleagues, neighbors, and dozens of cold case detectives from across the country who had traveled to witness the resolution of a case that had become legendary in law enforcement circles. Judge Harmon allowed impact statements from the Fitzgerald family before pronouncing sentence. Michael Fitzgerald Jr., Catherine's nephew who had never met the aunt he was partially named after, spoke of the inheritance of grief that had shaped his family across generations. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, too frail to attend in person, had her statement read by Margaret. To the man who took my daughter, you stole not only Catherine's future, but pieces of all who loved her. For 48 years I have carried the weight of her absence, while you built a life of freedom and respect. I do not hate you. Hate would only take more from me than you've already taken. Instead, I pity the emptiness inside you that allowed such cruelty to exist alongside such pretense of goodness. When offered the opportunity to speak, Kowalski rose slowly to his feet. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted his glasses, a familiar gesture to former students that now seemed sinister in context. I have no explanation or justification to offer, he said, his academic's voice steady despite the circumstances. I have lived 2 lives, one visible to all, one known only to myself. I cannot undo what I did to Catherine Fitzgerald. I can only acknowledge it now at the end of my life, when such acknowledgement comes far too late to matter to anyone but historians of this case. Judge Harmon sentenced Kowalski to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available. At 78, with developing health issues, everyone understood this meant Kowalski would die in prison. As he was led from the courtroom, several observers noted that he turned briefly toward the Fitzgerald family, making eye contact with Margaret before deputies escorted him through the side door. In the months following the sentencing, Catherine's case transformed from an unsolved mystery to a teaching tool. The FBI added it to their training curriculum as an example of how genetic genealogy could resolve decades-old cases. Forensic science programs incorporated it into discussions about evidence preservation. Law enforcement agencies nationwide reviewed their own cold case files with renewed hope. For Cabell County, the case prompted a community-wide reckoning. The university established an ethics center focused on professional responsibility and moral courage. Local schools developed curriculum units on the case, teaching students about both the tragedy and the scientific advances that eventually solved it. The dorm site where Catherine died was transformed into a memorial garden dedicated to victims of violence. Catherine Fitzgerald's legacy extended beyond her tragic death to include the scientific progress her case inspired, the advocacy organization her mother founded, the legal career her sister pursued, and the countless cold cases that would find resolution through techniques pioneered in solving hers. On the first anniversary of Kowalski's sentencing, Elizabeth Fitzgerald passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her obituary, written by Margaret, noted that she died having witnessed the justice she sought for nearly 5 decades, her life's mission completed. If you want more solved cold cases like this one, subscribe. Every week we explore how modern science and dedicated investigators are bringing closure to families who have waited years, sometimes decades, for answers. From genetic genealogy breakthroughs to advanced forensic techniques, we'll take you inside the investigations that are rewriting cold case history, one DNA strand at a time.